So often when we think of injustice or oppression in the world, we frame it in human rights terms. We think, it's my human right not to have to face poverty. It's my human right not to have to face discrimination. It's my human right to be a bad bitch about town. So you might be forgiven for thinking that Marxism has always been open to this way of expressing injustice and oppression in the world. But if you thought that, you're a fool, and I don't forgive you. I don't know why I said that. I do forgive you. That's why I made this video. So human rights and Marxism have had a pretty contentious relationship over the years, which is expressed today when YouTubers do bad reductive videos claiming that human rights are necessarily anti-Marxist. That's not this video, by the way. This is a good reductive video about why human rights might be okay for Marxism. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this deep dive into human rights and Marxism, I guess, if you're the kind of person who would click on this video. Enjoy! So, in this video I'm going to talk about 3 specific criticisms of human rights and their limits. 1. That Marx was explicitly against human rights. 2. That human rights necessarily mask the economic and class divisions in society and are therefore bourgeois ideology. And C or 3, depending on your perspective, that human rights are necessarily tools of Western imperialism. By engaging properly with these 3 criticisms of human rights, I'm going to try and show how human rights can be enriched by a broadly Marxist perspective, but also how human rights might be useful to a Marxist project. Human rights language is so ubiquitous and so common that to blindly jettison all the rhetoric and human rights struggles as necessarily anti-Marxist would be, in my view, stupid. Yeah, stupid. Much of the criticism of human rights from Marxist perspectives originates, maybe unsurprisingly, from the work of Karl Marx. You ever think it's lucky that Karl Marx became a Marxist? It's like Jesus being born on Christmas. Amazing. So, let's look at his most comprehensive engagement with the concept of rights, his response to Bruno Bauer on the Jewish question, which he wrote when he was 25. I'm 26 now. Do you think my YouTube videos will still be talked about in 200 years? Nah, that's silly. Humans won't exist in 200 years. The content of this essay is Marx disagreeing with Bauer over whether Jews should be given civil rights. Marx says they should, whereas Bauer thinks they shouldn't. Because he was a dick, probably. In arguing his case, Marx makes the point that civil rights in a capitalist system produce an illusory freedom, one that's more formal than real. And this has led loads of people down the line to make the argument that this is Marx saying that rights per se are useless. The problem with that analysis is that this is Marx specifically arguing here that Jewish people should receive civil rights from the state, but that freedom is, because of the nature of capitalism, inherently limited. Rather than just wholeheartedly dismissing the concept of rights, Marx is here making an argument that's closer to, yeah, these are good, but insufficient in the struggle for true freedom. But that's just Marx talking about civil rights. What about
the rights of man?
Marx's work on the rights of man here is more explicitly negative, which doesn't bode well for me. Essentially, Marx believes the rights of man, which are separate from civil rights, and include things like the right to freedom, the right to property, the right to security. He thinks that these are basically just negative freedoms, which tell everyone just to stay out of each other's shit. They generate atomization and egoism, which separates man from society, and conceive of freedom as only the separation of man from man, dude from dude.
But the right of man to freedom is not based on the association of man with man, but rather on the separation of man from man. It is the right of this separation, the right of the restricted individual, restricted to himself.
And much like Marx, we here at JohntheDuncan fully condone man-to-man connection.
Turn around, you little cunt. Oh, fucking
The thing about all these critiques from Marx about the illusory nature of civil rights and the bourgeois ideology of atomised, property-protecting rights of man is that they are correct. And I'm sure Marx would be thrilled to hear me say so. Marx would have liked me. Would Marx have liked me? Marx would have liked me. Yeah, Marx would have liked me. But, and there was always a but coming, what Marx is criticising here isn't rights per se, but a particular social manifestation of the rights of man under 19th century capitalism, which appears as negative property protecting rights. But that's no longer how human rights manifest. Today, human rights includes a broad array of economic and social rights as well as group rights, which necessarily don't presuppose negative freedom or atomised visions of the individual. I mean, it's understandable that he didn't account for this because, as far as I know, he couldn't see through time, as far as I know. And in fact, lots of people, many of them defenders of Marx and Marxists themselves, have argued that his conception of rights on the Jewish question is undialectical, which is my new bit. If someone is annoying me in a comment, I'm just going to start calling them undialectical. And Marx here is being undialectical. Beyond on the Jewish question, it's worth dealing with other times Marx wrote on rights, just to head off some people who are furiously typing essays in the comments right now. Do leave a comment though, because it helps with the algorithm gods. We are but vessels on the whims of the algorithm gods. One particularly cutting dismissal of the concept of rights appears in the German ideology, in which Marx and his hype man Engels write that,
As far as law is concerned, we with many others have stressed the opposition of communism to law, both political and private, as also in its most general form as the rights of man.
yeah, so this might seem devastating for my case, but it's presented less as an argument, never mind a theory of rights, and more of a declarative statement. Later in Critique of the Gotha programme, Marx again offers a criticism of rights in a similar vein as on the Jewish question. He argues that such rights can never achieve the freedom to which their lofty rhetoric attests because they don't fundamentally deal with the underlying economic conditions which inhibit freedom in the first place. Basically, they don't deal with capitalism. For Marx, only once capitalism has been abolished
Can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety and society inscribe on its banner, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs?
As O'Connell points out though, this can either be read as a thorough dismissal of the concept of rights in their entirety, or more generously, for me, it can be read as a critique of blind faith in rights which highlights their inability to achieve their high ideals within a capitalist frame. To back up my position and not just look like I'm bullshitting to prove myself right, I can point to multiple times in which Marx has frequently used and defended particular rights. From his frequent and vociferous attacks on censorship, that's right, Marx was a free speech guy, just like Ricky Gervais in that respect. I'm sorry, I didn't mean that. I didn't mean to compare Marx to Ricky Gervais. Oh god, if I'm going to get cancelled, it's for that. From his frequent and vociferous attacks on censorship, to his defence of the right to universal suffrage, and his glowing praise of the struggle to limit the working day to 10 hours, while his good bitch Engels often wrote in defence of the right to protest. And all of this is to say that Marx's work on rights was not at all times consistent, sometimes contradictory, often critical, but by no means decisive. From Marx's writing, you certainly can't get to the position that human rights are necessarily anti-Marxist, especially in the context of the massive variation of human rights movements as they exist today. And of course, Marx wasn't being dialectical enough. The second major Marxist criticism of human rights is that they obscure the economic and class nature of oppression under capitalism and are therefore bourgeois ideology. So this is another case of, yes, human rights sometimes do this, but also sometimes they don't. Let me explain. Criticisms of human rights that make this argument are really making the case that it's the dominant and hegemonic form of human rights, that is, international law or big human rights NGOs that are mainly based in the West, that it's them that tend to mask the class and economic character of oppression under capitalism. Even though economic and social rights are part of the international legal human rights system, they tend to remain secondary to civil and political rights, which are more individualising and tend to create a separation between the economic and the political, which all good Marxists know is bullshit. This is doubly emphasised when you've got big human rights organisations like Human Rights Watch, who argued until really recently that economic and social rights shouldn't be considered human rights at all. It was still a debate within my master's course on human rights about whether economic and social rights are really human rights, which is mad. It drove me insane.
I feel like I'm taking crazy pills!
But even if you include economic and social rights, the idea that we all have these rights, that we can all access equally and are therefore on an equal footing within capitalism, is itself problematic. Like Marx said, where there's equal rights, force decides. This goes hand in hand with what's called the Displacement Hypothesis, which argues that human rights and this claim to equality under the law necessarily crowds out other economic and class-based forms of analysis and rhetoric.
Wait, don't be fooled! She's just a regular Malibu Stacy with a stupid cheap hat! She still embodies all the awful stereotypes she did before!
But she's got a new hat.
But to see these criticisms as the final word on human rights is itself to place a primacy on the abstract vision of the essential character of human rights as derived from their dominant social manifestation under capitalism. Fucking hell, that was a sentence. Basically, to accept that criticism entirely is to accept a bourgeois narrative on the concept of rights. So congratulations, you've played yourself. It doesn't account for the ways in which competing meanings of human rights are generated and constructed by anti-capitalist social movements when they organise around a rights claim as an expression of their oppression. An expression of their oppression. Could have written that better. To essentialise human rights like these criticisms do is to separate the theory from the struggle. As Marxists, we should foreground the actual struggle of groups who engage with human rights language and understand it through that concrete struggle. And there are loads of examples of social movements who articulate their oppression through both human rights language and explicitly anti-capitalist rhetoric. From the Right to Water campaign in Ireland, to the Right to Housing campaign in London, to the sex workers' rights movement, to disability rights movements, all of them articulate their oppression in both human rights language and the language of class and economics. The Right to Housing movement explicitly highlights how attacks on housing is a class issue and one that is the direct result of capitalist exploitation. Right to Water campaigns on the idea that water is a basic human need, which should never be commodified, which is in direct opposition to the form of neoliberal capitalism under which we currently live. And the only reason that water is being commodified in Ireland was, in the words of Right to Water, because of an economic and political system built on greed.
Greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works.
And then there's the sex workers' rights movement, which is often both explicitly Marxist and explicitly rights-based, or the case of blacklisted workers in England who used human rights to organise around gaining labour rights, or the case of the disability rights movement, who are often at the sharp end of campaigning against things like austerity and the economic exploitation and oppression to which they're facing. They're facing oppression. I've been recording for too long. In all these cases, and many, many more, The human rights language is used to draw attention to the economic and class-based oppression caused by capitalism. It doesn't crowd out or obscure the class relations, but reveals them through the concrete struggle to make the lofty goals of human rights a reality. And as Marx argued, until capitalism is transcended, such goals will always remain out of reach. Anti-capitalist human rights organisers make that clear, and they often do it outside of the structures of liberal bourgeois law, and often even outside of the structures of the state. A good example of this is Malcolm X, who argued that the civil rights movement in the US focused attention just on the emancipation of black Americans. Instead, he argued for a human rights struggle, one that is transnational and recognises that the emancipation of black people is a global movement, not one that's just confined to the United States. While maybe not explicitly Marxist, Malcolm X was a radical actor utilising human rights in a radical way. But again, that's not to say that human rights can't or don't often obscure the class relations and a character of oppression under capitalism. They frequently do, especially when they're used in the dominant hegemonic form through bourgeois international law or through international big Western NGOs. But what my examples show is that this isn't an essential feature of human rights, and instead human rights is a site of contestation between what we can, drawing on the work of Gramsci, whose birthday it was recently, happy birthday Gramsci, what we can call the hegemonic common sense versus a counter-hegemonic good sense. Human rights as a thing can gain from critical Marxist perspectives which highlight this tension and ultimately support the counter-hegemony being formed in the concrete struggles of anti-capitalist or class-based social movements. Look at me being dialectical.
Over.
The third and final big criticism of human rights, then, is that they are a tool of Western imperialism. Now this is also true, and you'll see where I'm going with this, sometimes. On one level, human rights have always been used as a cudgel with which they can, beat non-Western states and justify interventionism. And on another, often the very structures of international law themselves blunt any potential radical new concept of rights. A good example of this, just to keep things nice and light, is the concept of genocide. Originally, the drafter of the Genocide Convention and coiner of the term, Raphael Lemkin, had explicitly tied the concept of genocide to imperialism. But in the post-war period, the big imperial powers like the US and the UK didn't much like the idea that genocide and imperialism went hand in hand, because it would mean that they were pretty big on the old genocide and they didn't really want that to be the case. So under pressure from the US and the UK, the allusions to imperialism within the Genocide Convention were stricken from international law. Which isn't to say that the Genocide Convention is entirely useless, but it does highlight how its inherent radicalness was blunted through the process of international law so that it could no longer pose a threat to the status quo. I talk about this in more detail in my video on the Iraq War, which is also, as you can imagine, a massive barrel of laughs. So what examples like this indicate is that human rights may well have been part of that imperial project, and there's lots of people who argue that they have. But again, that's not true of human rights as such, but of the dominant hegemonic version of human rights that's often projected by those states. And we can again look at concrete examples of social movements around the world which use human rights to specifically organise against imperialism. And in fact, the very hegemonic status of human rights is what's allowed it to be used in this counter-hegemonic way. Fuck, I'm saying hegemonic too much, haven't I? By becoming a universalised and recognisable language with which various different groups can understand and express their oppression, so human rights language has become useful in creating links between disparate social movements across the global south and creating broad social movements which have specifically organised against Western imperialism. A good example of this is the international agrarian and peasants movement Via Campesina, which has used human rights language to create linkages between various different farmers and peasants groups across the world and has rejected the international bourgeois legal system in favour of defining and describing its own form of human rights. In doing so, they often resist the institutionalisation of their rights claims for fear that their radicalness will be blunted in favour of undermining and going after international institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, which is good because fuck those piss boys. I'm saying fuck too much as well. Via Campesina isn't seeking integration within these liberal bourgeois structures, but is instead specifically resisting them and resisting their encroachment on their way of life. It is anti-colonial, anti-capitalist, and human rights claims are central to it. To draw on Gramsci again, this counter-hegemonic movement is taking and inverting parts of the hegemonic liberal ideology of human rights to suit its own needs. This is why we see anti-capitalists taking and unmasking the fraud of human rights as it exists under capitalism and arguing that only once we exist beyond capitalism can we be truly emancipated. Can these rights truly mean anything? These examples show how, far from being anti-Marxist, utilising human rights as a tool for generating and sustaining counter-hegemonic anti-capitalist action might well be a useful tool for Marxists to use. Via Campesina is a huge international movement, and I feel like Marxists would gain from engaging in that rather than dismissing it as anti-Marxist. Rather than rejecting human rights claims outright, we should engage with social movements who organise around them and use them to grow our movement together. As Colin Barker argues, the Marxist aim is to actively promote good sense, not by imposing some new principle of action or thought from outside a movement, but rather by working to renovate and make critical an already existing form of practice. Movements have themselves already accumulated repertoires of activity, organisation and ideas with whose development communists should engage in ongoing practical dialogue. Critical engagement with human rights from the left in general and Marxists in particular can be really incisive and useful for criticising human rights movements, but it can sometimes be quite lazy too. We shouldn't just look at Marx's writing on a concept of rights which didn't really exist when he was writing, and therefore claim that we shouldn't engage with human rights or that they're simply anti-Marxist. That's not theory, that's dogma. While there are lots of good criticisms of bourgeois legalism and its limits, and Marxist perspectives on this are essential to remind us that until capitalism is transcended, freedom is essentially illusory. But bourgeois legalism isn't all that human rights is. Instead, human rights language is often used by anti-capitalist social movements in ways which have radically challenged dominant capitalist understandings and have been useful precisely because of their universalising and flexible language, which has allowed radically different groups to form global anti-capitalist social movements. This is the benefit that Marxists can get from engaging in human rights, rather than just dismissing them because you're too, I don't know, bored or lazy to really deal with it. And just like a cheap point, I know you can't like market your way into, socialism or anything, but maybe it's not great if we associate Marxism with being anti-human rights. Maybe that's not a great bit of rhetoric if we do that. Maybe that's not great if we associate Marxism with human rights abuses. Maybe that's not great. That's all I'm saying. Maybe it's not great. So to the question of are human rights necessarily anti-Marxist? Well, the answer is more interesting and more dialectical than even Marx saw. Because the answer is sometimes they are, and sometimes they aren't. 3,000 words, 3,500 words to get to that point. I hope you don't feel like you've wasted your time. I have. That's more general point about my life. Well, this is tired John from immediately post-editing. It's 4 AM, so I'm knackered. But thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, then please feel free to leave a comment, hit the like and subscribe and the wee bell thingamajig. I'm unsure how well this video will do since it's a bit dense and it's really just about a personal bugbear of mine, so I'm not really sure if anyone else is going to be really that interested. So if you are, or if you think you know someone who might be, then please share it around. Also massive thanks to Catherine for being the voice of Karl Marx in this video. She's got a great channel that everyone should check out. And thanks to all my patrons who are helping me make this video and get through my PhD. Particularly thanks to Paul Singleton, Tamash Kispeter, Seamus Morrison, Stephanie Beverley, Sinan, J. Fraser Cartwright, Jamtapot, Nelly Zachefa, Mercutio, Sean McIntyre and Cameron Blakeman. Now if you'll excuse me, it's bedtime for me, because I've got a big day tomorrow of calling people undialectical on Twitter just to piss them off. Cheers.